Hello there, and welcome. Settle in, make yourself comfortable. Tonight, we're embarking on a little journey, a journey back in time. We're going to tiptoe our way into the quiet, often misunderstood world of medieval monks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, when you think of monks, what comes to mind? Chances are, it's images of serene figures, draped in simple robes, silently chanting in grand stone monasteries. Maybe you picture them diligently copying ancient texts, their quills scratching away in dimly lit scriptoriums. Perhaps you even imagine them existing in a state of perpetual piety, utterly detached from the messy, complicated world outside their cloistered walls. And well, there's some truth to that image. Monks were indeed often dedicated to prayer, study, and manual labor. Many lived lives of impressive devotion, contributing immensely to the preservation of knowledge and the development of Western culture. But that's not the whole story, is it? Because beneath those simple robes, behind those serene smiles, and within those seemingly impenetrable monastery walls, there was, well, life. And life, as it turns out, is rarely simple, or predictable, or entirely pious. You see, these weren't just automatons of abstinence. They were people, real, breathing, feeling people with all the same desires, temptations and flaws as anyone else. And when you cram a bunch of people together, even under the strictest of rules, things are bound to get interesting. We're talking power struggles, whispered disputes, and yes, even the occasional scandal. We're going to delve into instances of rule breaking, a little too much ale during feast days perhaps, maybe a secret stash of forbidden cheeses. We'll explore the challenges of celibacy in a world where, let's face it, human nature is, well, human. And we'll even uncover instances of forbidden love, secrets that have been carefully guarded within monastery walls for centuries. Shocking secrets, I promised, didn't I? Now, I'm not talking about Dan Brown level conspiracies here. No hidden alien artifacts or secret societies controlling the world as far as I know anyway. The shocking part comes from the stark contrast between the image we think we know and the reality of life within those monasteries. It's about peeling back the layers of myth and legend to reveal the very human stories underneath. Think about it, these men and of course women in convents, which we'll also touch on, were often cut off from their families, their past lives, their earthly ambitions. They were expected to renounce worldly pleasures and dedicate themselves entirely to God. That's a big ask. And what happened when they struggled? When the weight of those vows felt too heavy? When temptation knocked at the door of their lonely cells? That's what we're here to find out. We're going to explore the hidden corners of monastic life, the parts that history books often gloss over, the whispers that echoed through the cloisters late at night. But before we dive into the scandalous stuff, let's take a step back and set the stage. We need to understand where monasticism came from, how these communities were structured, and what life was supposed to be like within those walls. We need to dispel some of those persistent myths, because you see, the story of medieval monks isn't just a story of quiet contemplation and pious devotion. It's a story of human beings grappling with faith, temptation, and the challenges of living together in a world that was both incredibly harsh and surprisingly complex. It's a story of secrets, scandals, and ultimately, the enduring power of the human spirit. So dim the lights just a little more, take a deep breath, and let's begin to uncover some fascinating secrets, shall we? You might just be surprised by what we find. Music fades up slightly. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's gently drift back in time, way back to explore the fascinating and often misunderstood origins of monasticism. We're talking about how it all began, before those grand monasteries with their secret libraries and, well, you know, other secrets, were even a twinkle in anyone's eye. Now, when we picture monks, we probably conjure up images of, well, medieval monks, chanting in Latin, copying manuscripts, maybe sneaking a bit of wine. But the seeds of monasticism were actually sown much earlier, way back in the early days of Christianity. Think desert landscapes, extreme dedication, and a whole lot of solitary reflection. The story really starts with a yearning for a deeper, more authentic connection with God, a feeling that the everyday world, with all its distractions and temptations, just wasn't conducive to truly living a Christian life. And it's a feeling that many still share today, isn't it? That pull to disconnect, to simplify, to find peace in quiet contemplation. So, who were these early pioneers of monasticism? They were often called the Desert Fathers and Desert Mothers, and they were quite literally folks who went out into the desert to seek God. Places like Egypt, Palestine, and Syria became havens for these spiritual seekers. Imagine trading your comfortable life for, well, basically nothing. Scorching sun, barren landscapes, and the occasional scorpion for company. Sounds appealing. These weren't your typical hermits. They weren't just misanthropes who hated people. They were driven by a profound desire to escape the temptations of the world, things like wealth, status, and worldly pleasures. They sought a life of prayer, fasting, and self-denial, a life focused entirely on God. It was a radical choice, a complete rejection of societal norms. Can you imagine the looks they must have gotten from their families? You're doing what with your life? One of the most famous of these early hermits was Saint Anthony of Egypt. He's often considered the father of monasticism. Around the year 270 AD, Anthony sold all his possessions, retreated to the desert, and lived a life of extreme asceticism. Stories about his struggles with demons and temptations became legendary. He battled inner demons, external temptations, and the sheer boredom of, well, being alone in the desert. But his unwavering faith and dedication inspired countless others. Think about that for a moment. You're choosing a life that has absolutely no glamour. You're not going to become famous or rich, just holy. Anthony wasn't alone for long. Soon, other like-minded individuals began to seek him out, drawn to his wisdom and spiritual guidance. They settled near him, forming small communities of hermits. These weren't monasteries in the traditional sense. Each hermit still lived in his own separate dwelling, a simple hut or cave, but they would gather together for communal prayer and support. It was the beginning of something, a sense of community amidst the solitude. This early form of monasticism, where individuals lived separately but under the guidance of a spiritual leader, is often called anchoritic or eremitic monasticism. Anchorite comes from the Greek word for to withdraw. These were the true solitary souls, the ones who craved complete isolation. Now, living as a hermit wasn't exactly a walk in the park or a stroll through the desert. As the case may be, it was a constant battle against the elements, against hunger and thirst, and against the inner demons of doubt and despair. These early monks had to be incredibly resilient, both physically and mentally. But as monasticism evolved, a new form began to emerge: cenobitic monasticism. Cenobitic comes from the Greek word for common life. This was the shift from solitary living to communal living, and it was a pretty big deal. One of the key figures in this transition was Saint Pachomius. In the early 4th century, Pachomius established the first organized monastic community in Egypt. He believed that living together in a structured community, with shared rules and responsibilities, offered a better path to spiritual growth. This wasn't just about convenience or companionship. It was about creating an environment where humility, obedience, and mutual support could flourish. Pachomius developed a rule or set of guidelines for his monks to follow. This rule governed every aspect of their lives, from prayer and work to meals and sleep. It was a blueprint for communal living, designed to foster discipline and spiritual growth. Imagine living your entire life according to a strict set of rules, no deviation allowed. Sounds regimented. In Pachomius's monasteries, monks lived in shared dwellings, worked together in common fields, and prayed together in a communal chapel. They ate their meals in silence, listening to scripture readings. Everything was structured, ordered, and designed to promote spiritual focus. The shift to Cenobitic monasticism had a profound impact. It created a more stable and sustainable form of monastic life. It allowed for the transmission of knowledge and skills from one generation of monks to the next, and it provided a framework for managing the practical aspects of monastic life, such as food production, clothing, and healthcare. But it also introduced new challenges. Living in close proximity with others, even those dedicated to spiritual pursuits, inevitably led to conflicts and disagreements. The Pachomian rule aimed to minimize these conflicts by emphasizing obedience to the abbot, the leader of the monastery. The abbot had absolute authority, and his word was law. It was a system designed to maintain order and prevent chaos. I suppose that's one way to keep the peace, right? So why did this shift to communal living happen? Why did so many choose to embrace the structure and discipline of Cenobitic monasticism? Well, there were several reasons. For some, it was simply a matter of practicality. Living alone in the desert was incredibly difficult, and many found that they couldn't sustain it for long. Communal living offered a more secure and stable environment. For others, it was a matter of spiritual growth. They believed that living in community, with its challenges and opportunities for self-sacrifice, could help them overcome their selfishness and develop virtues like humility and compassion. And for still others, it was a matter of mission. They saw monastic communities as a way to serve others and to spread the gospel. They provided hospitality to travelers, cared for the sick, and offered spiritual guidance to those in need. Whatever the reasons, the rise of Cenobitic monasticism marked a turning point in the history of Christianity. It created a new model for religious life, one that would have a lasting impact on Western civilization. The idea of living in community dedicated to prayer, worship, and service became very popular and widespread. The early monks, whether they were solitary hermits or members of organized communities, laid the foundation for the monastic tradition that would flourish for centuries to come. Their dedication, their sacrifices, and their unwavering faith continue to inspire us today, even if their lifestyles seem a little extreme. All right, settle in everyone. Tonight, we're turning our attention to a figure often hailed as the father of Western monasticism, Benedict of Nursia. Now, before you start picturing stern-faced monks silently shuffling through stone corridors, let's unpack who this guy was and why his ideas were kind of a big deal. Benedict, born around 480 AD in Nursia, Italy, wasn't exactly destined for a life of quiet contemplation. He came from a noble family, which meant he was supposed to, make a name for himself, climb the social ladder, maybe even get involved in politics. But according to the stories, the chaos and moral decay of Rome at the time rubbed him the wrong way. So instead of pursuing a glittering career, he decided to ditch the city and embrace a life of, solitude. Now, this wasn't totally out of the blue. The idea of retreating from the world to focus on spiritual growth was already gaining traction. Think of it as the ancient world's version of going off the grid. There were hermits living in the deserts of Egypt, practicing extreme asceticism. Fasting, sleeping on the ground, maybe even wrestling metaphorical demons or literal ones, depending on your interpretation. Benedict initially followed a similar path. He became a hermit, living in a cave near Subiaco. And get this, legend says he was fed by a monk who lowered bread down to him in a basket. Talk about room service. But here's where Benedict's story takes a turn. His reputation for holiness started to spread, and other people, perhaps tired of the rat race themselves, began seeking him out. They wanted him to be their spiritual guide. And this is where things get interesting, because Benedict wasn't just about individual piety. He believed in the power of community. So he started organizing these followers into monastic communities. And that's where the rule of Saint Benedict comes in. Now, the rule wasn't some fire and brimstone list of commandments. Instead, it was a practical, surprisingly balanced guide for how to live a monastic life. It emphasized prayer, labor, study, and obedience. Think of it as the ultimate organizational handbook for monasteries. Benedict laid out everything, from how many psalms to recite each day, to what kind of food monks should eat, to how the abbot, the head of the monastery, should lead the community. One of the key principles of the rule was ora et labora, which translates to pray and work. This wasn't just about praying all day, it was about finding a balance between spiritual devotion and manual labor. Monks were expected to contribute to the community by working in the fields, tending the gardens, or crafting things with their hands. This emphasis on work helped to keep the monasteries self-sufficient and, more importantly, kept the monks from getting bored. Another crucial element was obedience. Monks took a vow of obedience to the abbot, who was seen as Christ's representative in the monastery. Now, this wasn't about blind, unquestioning submission. The abbot was expected to lead with wisdom and compassion, and the monks were expected to offer counsel and support. It was a system of mutual responsibility, designed to maintain order and harmony within the community. But the rule wasn't all about strict regulations. It also emphasized moderation and balance. Benedict recognized that monks were human beings with needs and desires. He allowed for reasonable amounts of food and sleep, and he encouraged monks to treat each other with kindness and respect. In fact, the rule is surprisingly humane. It acknowledges the weaknesses of human nature and provides a framework for dealing with them in a constructive way. It's all about finding a middle ground between excessive asceticism and worldly indulgence. Now, why was the rule so influential? Well, for a few reasons. First, it was incredibly practical. It provided a clear, concise, and comprehensive guide for monastic life. Second, it was adaptable. Different monasteries could interpret and apply the rule in ways that suited their specific needs and circumstances. And third, it was, well, effective. Monasteries that followed the rule tended to be stable, prosperous, and spiritually vibrant. Over time, the rule of Saint Benedict became the standard for monastic life in Western Europe. It shaped the development of countless monasteries, from the sprawling abbeys of England to the remote monasteries of the Alps. And these monasteries weren't just places of prayer and contemplation, they were also centers of learning and culture. Monks preserved ancient texts, copied manuscripts, and developed new agricultural techniques. They provided education, healthcare, and hospitality to travelers and the poor. In many ways, monasteries were the lifeblood of medieval society. So what can we learn from Benedict of Nursia and the rule? Well, perhaps it's the importance of balance, finding a way to integrate prayer, work, and community into our lives. Or maybe it's the value of structure and discipline, creating a framework that helps us to achieve our goals and live according to our values. Or maybe it's simply the power of kindness and compassion, treating ourselves and others with understanding and respect. Whatever the lesson, Benedict of Nursia's legacy continues to resonate today. His ideas about monastic life shaped the course of Western civilization, and his insights into human nature remain relevant for anyone seeking a more meaningful and fulfilling life. And that, my friends, is the story of Benedict of Nursia. the man, the myth, and the rule that shaped Western monasticism. Now let's move on and explore what it was really like to enter one of these monasteries. Alright, settling in? Good, good. Let's drift into the fascinating world of how one actually became a medieval monk. It wasn't quite as simple as filling out an application, though there were certainly hoops to jump through. Think of it less like getting a job and more like, well, like completely changing your reality permanently. First things first, let's dispel a common misconception. Not just anyone could stroll into a monastery and declare their intention to join. Monasteries were discerning institutions, and they had standards. They weren't exactly running an open-door policy for every Tom, Dick, and Harry looking for a free meal and a bed. Often, social status played a role. While theoretically all were welcome in God's eyes, in practice, recruits often came from families who could offer something of value to the monastery, be it land, money, or influence. But even if you had the right background, you couldn't just waltz in. The process began with an application, of sorts. A postulant, that's what they called someone who wanted to become a monk, would approach the abbot, the head of the monastery, and formally request admission. This wasn't a quick chat over tea, it was a serious, solemn affair. The abbot would carefully assess the postulant's motivations, character, and suitability for monastic life. Was this a genuine calling, or a fleeting desire to escape the world? Were they physically and mentally capable of enduring the rigors of monastic discipline? Did they have any secret debts or obligations that could disrupt the community? These were all crucial questions. Think about it. Monasteries were essentially self-sufficient communities. They needed individuals who could contribute, not create problems. A disruptive or unstable individual could upset the delicate balance of monastic life and undermine the entire community. So the abbot had to be certain. Now, let's say our aspiring monk passed the initial assessment. He wasn't burdened with debt, appeared genuinely devout, and seemed reasonably sane. The next stage was the novitiate. This was essentially a trial period, a time for the postulant to live within the monastery and experience monastic life firsthand. The length of the novitiate varied, but it typically lasted for about a year. During this year, the novice, as he was now known, lived under the guidance of a senior monk, often called the novice master. The novice master was responsible for instructing the novice in the rules of the order, the daily routines, and the spiritual practices of monastic life. It was a period of intense learning and rigorous self-examination. The novice participated in all the activities of the monks, the daily prayers, the manual labor, the study of sacred texts. He learned to chant the psalms, to till the fields, to copy manuscripts, and to observe the strict rules of silence and obedience. He was constantly observed and evaluated by the novice master and other members of the community. This was a crucial period for both the novice and the monastery. It allowed the novice to determine if monastic life was truly his calling, and it allowed the monastery to assess his character, his commitment, and his ability to integrate into the community. Many novices decided during this time that monastic life wasn't for them, and they were free to leave without any stigma attached. It was considered far better to leave during the novitiate than to take vows and later break them. And speaking of vows, after the novitiate, if the novice and the monastery were both satisfied, came the momentous occasion of taking the monastic vows. This was a formal, solemn ceremony in which the novice publicly committed himself to the monastic life. There were three main vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty meant renouncing all personal possessions and living a simple life, sharing everything in common with the community. Chastity meant abstaining from sexual activity and remaining celibate for life. And obedience meant submitting to the authority of the abbot and the rules of the order. These weren't just empty words, they were binding commitments, vows made before God and the community. Breaking them was considered a grave sin, and it carried serious consequences, both spiritual and practical. The vows were usually taken in stages. First, the novice would take temporary vows, committing himself to the monastic life for a period of 1 year. This allowed for further testing and discernment. After a year, if all was still well, he could then take solemn vows, which were binding for life. The ceremony for taking solemn vows was a deeply moving and symbolic event. The novice would typically lie prostrate before the altar, symbolizing his complete submission to God. The abbot would then question him about his intentions and his understanding of the vows. The novice would then recite the vows in a clear and audible voice, committing himself to poverty, chastity, and obedience for the rest of his life. After taking the vows, the novice was now a fully professed monk, a member of the monastic community for life. He was given a new habit, the distinctive clothing of the order, and he was assigned a permanent place within the monastery. He was now part of something larger than himself, a member of a community dedicated to prayer, work, and the pursuit of God. It was a profound transformation, a complete reorientation of one's life, leaving behind the world, its temptations and its distractions, to embrace a life of simplicity, discipline, and devotion. A life of silence, prayer, and service. It wasn't for everyone, certainly, but for those who truly felt called to it, it offered a path to spiritual fulfillment and a deeper connection with the divine. And that, my friend, is how you became a medieval monk. Quite a journey, wasn't it? Time to rest your head now. Let those images simmer, sweet dreams. Alright, settle in, friends. Time to imagine our lives if we were medieval monks, and more specifically, what a typical day would look like. Prepare for a lot of routine. Now, some might think monastic life was all wine and cheese making, and well, sometimes there was cheese, I suppose, but mostly, it was a life of incredibly structured spirituality. Let's dive into the Opus Dei, the work of God, the daily schedule that governed every waking and even sleeping moment. And just a warning, it's not exactly a sleep-in kind of lifestyle. Picture this. The first bell, matins or vigils, rings sometime between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. Yes, you read that right, 2 or 3 in the morning. Now imagine the scene, a cold, dark dormitory, maybe just a shared room with multiple monks, lit by only a flickering candle, if you're lucky. You're roused from a probably not very comfortable bed, likely a straw mattress on a wooden frame, and shuffle, half asleep, to the church. The purpose of matins, to begin the day with prayer, dedicating the monks' lives to God before anything else. It's a service of psalms, readings and hymns, maybe lasting a couple of hours. The cold stone, the groggy minds, the chanting in the darkness. It's quite a way to start the day, isn't it? Not exactly hitting snooze. Next up, after a very short break for, well, frankly, probably just shivering and contemplating the meaning of existence, comes Lauds, around dawn. This is the morning prayer, praising God for the new day. More psalms, more hymns, and readings. A continuation of the themes established at matins, but this time, hopefully with a little more light filtering through the stained glass windows. A slightly cheerier vibe, perhaps. Though, after being awake since 2 a.m., cheery might be a slight overstatement. Now finally, comes a bit of a break. A small meal, maybe some bread and a bit of weak ale to tide you over. It's a brief respite before the day's real work begins. Time for prime, the first of the little hours, around 6 a.m. Again focused on psalms and prayers. This hour often included readings from the monastic rule, reminding the brothers of their vows and obligations. So even your break is pretty much still thinking about praying. Following prime, the monks would then head into assigned duties. This could vary wildly, depending on the monastery and the individual monk's skills. Some would work in the gardens, tending to vegetables and herbs. Others would be in the kitchens, preparing food. Some would work in the workshops, crafting tools, or repairing buildings. And of course, there's the scriptorium, where monks meticulously copied manuscripts, preserving knowledge for future generations. This period of work continues until around 9 a.m., when Teres, the next of the little hours, is observed. more psalms, prayers, and readings. You can probably see a pattern emerging, right? It's a structured rhythm of work and worship. After terrace, it's back to work until midday, when sext is observed, more psalms, prayers, and readings. By this point, it is probably beginning to feel repetitive, but the idea is that it all is to keep the monks focused on God throughout their day. Then finally, it's lunchtime. The main meal of the day, often consisting of vegetables, bread, and perhaps some cheese or fish. Meat was typically reserved for the sick or elderly. Meals were usually eaten in silence, while one of the monks read aloud from scripture or other religious texts, so even lunchtime is a meditative experience. After lunch, a short period of rest or study might be allowed, but before long, it's back to work until around 3 p.m., when none, the final of the little hours, is observed. Surprise, more psalms, prayers, and readings. Following none, work continues until Vespers, the evening prayer, around sunset. This service often featured hymns and psalms reflecting on the day's events and asking for God's blessing. Finally, the last service of the day is compline, before bedtime. This is a final prayer for peace and protection during the night. After compline, silence is strictly observed. No talking, no noise, just quiet contemplation before heading to bed. And then, after all that, a few short hours later, the bell rings again for matins, and the cycle begins anew. So there you have it, a typical day in the life of a medieval monk. A life of rigorous schedule, prayer, work, and study. It's a far cry from our modern lives, isn't it? A life completely dedicated to God, with very little room for anything else. I hope that didn't keep you up. Alright, settle in friends. Let's talk about food and drink in the medieval monastery. Now you might be thinking, monks, abstinence, they probably just gnawed on roots and drank water, right? Well, not exactly. The monastic diet was actually a fascinating dance between rules, resources, and shall we say, human nature. First, the rules. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed most Western monasteries, was pretty clear: moderation in all things. Meat was generally forbidden, especially the meat of four-footed animals. Think beef, pork, lamb, gone. This was supposed to reduce temptation, carnal desires and all that. Poultry, though, sometimes got a pass. Depends on the interpretation. So picture this, a bunch of monks debating the precise definition of four-footed. I can almost hear the whispers. So what did they eat? Well, a lot of vegetables. Beans, lentils, peas, the protein powerhouses of the medieval world. Gardens were essential, and monks were skilled gardeners. They grew all sorts of things: cabbages, onions, leeks, carrots, parsnips. It's all pretty standard fare, really. These would be boiled into stews, seasoned with herbs also grown in the garden, of course. Bread was another staple, usually made from whatever grains were available locally, which could be wheat, rye, or even barley. It was often pretty coarse, not exactly your artisanal sourdough. But hey, it filled you up. Dairy was permitted. Cheese, milk, butter. Again, essential sources of protein and fat. Monks were often skilled cheesemakers, and some monasteries became famous for their particular varieties. And then there's the drink. Water, of course, but also ale, and especially in wine-producing regions, wine. The rule of Saint Benedict allowed for a hemina of wine per day. That's about half a litre. Not a huge amount, but certainly enough to take the edge off. Some monks probably felt it helped them with their prayers, maybe made the hymns sound a bit sweeter, eh? The wine, like everything else, would depend on the location of the monastery and its climate. But here's where it gets interesting. That's the official diet. The reality was often a little more flexible. You see, monasteries varied wildly in wealth. Some were incredibly rich, owning vast tracts of land and receiving generous donations. Others were struggling to get by. A wealthy monastery could afford a more varied and plentiful diet. They might bend the rules a little, perhaps serving fish more frequently, or even discreetly turning a blind eye to the occasional bit of meat making its way to the table. After all, a hard-working monk needs his strength, doesn't he? And then there were feast days. Oh, the feast days. Christmas, Easter, the feast day of the monastery's patron saint. These were times for celebration, and that meant special food, better bread, maybe some cheese that wasn't usually available, perhaps even some, gasp, meat. Goose was a popular choice, but perhaps the biggest loophole in the monastic diet was the mitigations. These were extra rations, often of better food, given to monks who were ill, elderly, or engaged in particularly strenuous labor. Now, who decided what constituted strenuous labor? Well, that was up to the abbot, and I imagine there were some interesting interpretations. A monk copying a particularly long manuscript. Surely that qualifies. There were also designated fasting periods, most notably during Lent. During these times, the diet would become even more austere, perhaps just bread and water, or maybe a simple vegetable broth. This was meant to be a time of spiritual reflection and self-denial. But you know, human nature being what it is, monks sometimes found ways to supplement their fast. A particularly delicious root vegetable, perhaps, or maybe a little extra wine for medicinal purposes. And then there were the subtleties. For instance, fish was generally allowed, but what about beaver? Beavers, with their scaly tails and aquatic habits, were often classified as fish for dietary purposes. I mean, they live in the water, that's good enough, right? Again, those monks were quite creative. Another interesting detail, the refectory, the dining hall, was often a place of ritual and order. Monks ate in silence, while one of them read aloud from the Bible or some other religious text. This wasn't just about nourishment, it was about spiritual enrichment too. Although I imagine that after a while, hearing the same scripture over and over again while staring at a bowl of lentils might start to grate on a monk's nerves. So what can we take away from all this? The monastic diet wasn't just about deprivation, it was about balance, discipline, and surprisingly, a degree of flexibility. Monks weren't mindless automatons following rules blindly. They were human beings with appetites, desires, and a knack for finding loopholes. The monastic diet, in all its complexity, is a fascinating window into the lives of these medieval men. It shows us their struggles, their piety, and their very human capacity for occasional indulgence. I mean, who hasn't had a few too many glasses of wine at dinner, right? So next time you picture a medieval monk, don't just think of a gaunt figure in a brown robe. Think of a gardener, a cheesemaker, a scholar, a sinner, a man trying to find his way in the world, one bowl of lentils at a time, and maybe, just maybe, with a little glass of wine on the side. Now, if you'll excuse me, all this talk about food has made me hungry. Time for a little something before bed. Sleep tight. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's whisper our way into a quiet corner of the monastery, a place of hushed reverence, dedicated to preserving not just words but worlds. Welcome to the Scriptorium. Now, the word scriptorium might sound a bit grand, a little imposing, doesn't it? But in reality, it was often just a small room, or even a series of alcoves, tucked away within the monastery walls. Think of it as the medieval monk's version of a study, or maybe even a home office, although admittedly, without the ergonomic chair and the questionable coffee mug collection. The scriptorium was the heart of monastic intellectual life, the place where knowledge was painstakingly copied, preserved, and sometimes even expanded upon. Before the printing press, books were precious, unbelievably precious. Each one was a labor of love, a testament to the dedication and skill of the monks who created them. Imagine the scene, a small, sparsely furnished room, maybe lit by a single window, or perhaps just a flickering candle. The air is cool, still, and thick with the scent of parchment and ink. A monk, clad in his simple habit, sits hunched over a wooden desk, his brow furrowed in concentration. He's not just doodling in a notebook. Oh no, he's embarked on a journey of duplication, a slow and deliberate process of transcribing text from one manuscript to another. This could take months, even years, depending on the size and complexity of the book. Can you even imagine? We complain about typing a 5-page essay, and these guys were copying entire Bibles. But why, you might ask, did they go to all this trouble? Why not just, photocopy it? If only, right? Well, aside from the obvious lack of modern technology, there was a very good reason. Monasteries were the primary centers of learning during the Middle Ages. They were the keepers of knowledge, the safe havens for texts that might otherwise have been lost to time. Copying books was an act of devotion, a way to honor God, and to ensure that His word, and the wisdom of the ancients, would continue to be available for future generations. So, let's talk about the tools of the trade, shall we? Our monk wouldn't have had a fancy gel pen or a reliable laptop. His primary instrument was a quill, usually made from the feather of a goose or swan. These quills had to be carefully prepared, cured, and sharpened to a fine point. It's a delicate skill, requiring a steady hand and a lot of practice. I mean, imagine writing a whole book with something you carved from a feather. And then there's the ink. Forget your standard black ballpoint. Medieval ink was a fascinating concoction, often made from oak galls, iron sulfate, and gum arabic. It created a rich, dark color that has lasted for centuries. Monks even developed different colors of ink for special purposes, like red for headings and important passages. Imagine the recipe testing and the painstaking perfecting of the process. This wasn't just writing, this was medieval chemistry. But the scriptorium wasn't just about copying text. It was also a place of artistic expression. Medieval manuscripts are famous for their illuminations, those beautiful, intricate illustrations that adorn the pages. These weren't just random doodles, they were carefully planned and executed works of art, often depicting biblical scenes, historical events, or simply decorative patterns. Illuminators were highly skilled artists, often specializing in specific types of illustrations. Some focused on creating elaborate borders, filled with floral motifs and geometric designs. Others specialized in painting miniature portraits of saints and biblical figures, bringing the text to life with vibrant colors and meticulous detail. Gold leaf was a common element in illuminations, adding a touch of shimmering brilliance to the pages. Applying gold leaf was a delicate process, requiring incredible precision and patience. The gold had to be hammered into incredibly thin sheets and then carefully applied to the parchment using a special adhesive. I can barely put on gold eyeshadow without it looking like a disaster, let alone illuminate a manuscript with it. And then, of course, there's the calligraphy, the art of beautiful writing. Medieval monks were masters of calligraphy, developing a variety of different scripts, each with its own unique characteristics. There was Carolingian minuscule, a clear and legible script that became the standard for book production in the early Middle Ages. And then there was Gothic script, with its angular, ornate letter forms which became popular in later centuries. Each style had its own particular quirks and requirements, its own set of rules and conventions. Mastering these scripts required years of dedicated practice, a commitment to precision and beauty. Now, life in the scriptorium wasn't always easy. It was a demanding, often tedious job. The hours were long, the light was poor, and the work required intense concentration. Monks often suffered from eye strain, back pain, and cramped hands, and sometimes boredom. I imagine after months of copying, the words would start to swim before your eyes. But there were also moments of quiet satisfaction, of profound connection to the text. Copying a book wasn't just a mechanical task, it was an act of meditation, a way to immerse oneself in the wisdom of the past. Monks often added their own personal touches to the manuscripts, little notes and annotations in the margins, reflecting their own thoughts and insights. You can almost hear them thinking along with the text, and of course there were the inevitable mistakes. Scribes weren't perfect, and errors crept into the manuscripts from time to time. Sometimes it was a simple misspelling, other times it was a more serious omission or alteration of the text. But even these mistakes can be fascinating, offering a glimpse into the human side of the scriptorium. It's comforting to know, even in this world of dedicated work and perfection seeking, that humans will be humans. The scriptorium was more than just a workshop. It was a sanctuary, a place of learning, creativity, and devotion. It was here, in these quiet corners of the monastery, that the knowledge of the past was preserved for future generations, that the seeds of the Renaissance were sown. So next time you see a beautiful medieval manuscript, remember the monks who labored so diligently in the scriptorium, those silent guardians of knowledge, those unsung heroes of the written word. They may not be famous, they may not be celebrated, but their legacy lives on, in every carefully copied page, in every illuminated letter, in every beautifully crafted word. And now it's time for us to drift off, knowing that even in the quietest of places, extraordinary things can happen. Sweet dreams. Alright, settle in, friends, because we're about to tiptoe into a rather fascinating and surprisingly resourceful corner of the monastic world, the infirmary. Think of it as the medieval monk's version of a hospital, but with a whole lot more chanting and probably a few more leeches than your average doctor's office these days. In our modern world, we're accustomed to readily available medical care. Aches, pains, sniffles, a quick trip to the pharmacy, or a call to the doctor usually sets things right. But imagine a world where antibiotics are but a distant dream, and understanding of even basic hygiene is, shall we say, developing. Yeah, life expectancy wasn't exactly soaring back then. So what did our monastic friends do when sickness struck? Well, necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, or, in this case, the mother of some surprisingly clever herbal remedies, and a good dose of fervent prayer. Now, monasteries, being self-sufficient communities, typically dedicated a section of their grounds to the cultivation of medicinal herbs. Think of it as a medieval pharmacy, carefully tended to by monks with a knack for botany and a sincere desire to alleviate suffering. These weren't just random weeds plucked from the roadside. Oh no, these were carefully selected plants, each chosen for its specific healing properties, cultivated with the kind of dedication you usually see reserved for illuminated manuscripts. What sort of plants were we talking about? Well, think of things like chamomile, that gentle sleep aid we all know and love, was a monastic staple, used for its calming properties and to ease digestion. Mint, another familiar friend, was employed to soothe upset stomachs and clear congested airways. Then you have things like sage, used as an antiseptic, and lavender, not just for its pleasant scent, but also for its ability to reduce anxiety and promote sleep. You get the picture, a veritable garden of earthly delights, all dedicated to the noble pursuit of healing. The monks themselves were often the physicians, drawing upon a mix of ancient medical texts, passed down wisdom, and their own observations. The most common ailments that they were dealing with were things like digestive issues because of the food they ate, skin conditions from the lack of bathing, and injuries that were picked up from the labor that they were doing. These weren't always trained doctors in the modern sense, you understand. They were more like learned caregivers, combining practical skills with a strong faith in the power of prayer and the healing touch of God. But don't let that fool you. Some monastic physicians were incredibly knowledgeable, possessing a deep understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the properties of various herbs. Their approach to medicine was rather holistic. They believed that sickness wasn't just a physical ailment, but also a spiritual one. As such, treatment often involved a combination of herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, rest, and of course plenty of prayer. They might prescribe a specific herb to address a particular ailment, but they'd also encourage the patient to confess their sins, meditate on scripture, and seek solace in the divine. Now, let's talk about some of those remedies in a little more detail. One common treatment was the use of poultices, which were basically mashed up herbs applied directly to the skin. Think of it as a medieval version of a topical cream. These poultices could be used to soothe inflammation, draw out infection, or promote healing. For instance, a poultice of comfrey might be applied to a wound to speed up tissue regeneration, while a poultice of plantain could be used to relieve the sting of insect bites. Another popular method was the creation of infusions and decoctions. Infusions were made by steeping herbs in hot water, much like making tea. Decoctions, on the other hand, involved boiling herbs in water for a longer period of time, extracting more of their potent compounds. These herbal teas were used to treat a wide range of ailments, from coughs and colds to digestive problems and insomnia. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, herbs are nice, but what about more serious injuries or illnesses? Well, that's where things get a little interesting. For surgical procedures, monasteries typically relied on the expertise of barber surgeons. These weren't monks themselves, but rather lay practitioners who traveled from town to town, offering their services to those in need. Barber surgeons performed a variety of procedures, from bloodletting and wound dressing to setting broken bones and even performing amputations. Yeah, it wasn't exactly a pleasant profession. And speaking of bloodletting, this was a very common practice in medieval medicine. The idea was that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that draining excess blood could restore harmony to the body. In reality, of course, bloodletting often weakened patients and made them more susceptible to infection, but hey, they didn't know any better at the time. One of the things I find particularly fascinating about monastic medicine is the emphasis on preventative care. Monks understood that maintaining a healthy lifestyle was crucial for preventing illness in the first place. As such, they adhered to a strict regimen of diet, exercise, and rest, designed to keep their bodies and minds in tip-top shape. They also placed a strong emphasis on hygiene, although their understanding of germs was, shall we say, a bit rudimentary. They regularly washed their hands, cleaned their clothing, and maintained a clean living environment. Monasteries often had sophisticated sanitation systems, including latrines and drainage systems, designed to prevent the spread of disease. In the end, the monastic infirmary was more than just a place to treat the sick. It was a testament to the resourcefulness, compassion, and faith of these medieval monks. They may not have had access to modern medicine, but they did their best to alleviate suffering and promote healing, using the tools and knowledge available to them. And in doing so, they left behind a fascinating legacy of herbal remedies, holistic healing, and the enduring power of human kindness. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's meander through the tranquil world of monastic gardens and the surprisingly industrious lives those medieval monks led, tending the very land that sustained them. Forget dusty tomes and endless prayers for a moment. We're getting our hands dirty. You see, these monasteries weren't just spiritual retreats. They were often self-sufficient economic engines, and at the heart of that self-sufficiency, agriculture. Monks didn't just pray for their supper, they grew it. We're talking about vast swaths of land meticulously cultivated by these men of God, fields of grain swaying in the breeze, orchards bursting with fruit, and vegetable gardens that would make your modern organic farmer weep with envy. But why this emphasis on self-sufficiency? Well, several reasons. Firstly, it was practical. Remote monasteries couldn't exactly pop down to the local supermarket for supplies. They were often isolated, responsible for feeding not only themselves but also the poor, pilgrims and travelers who sought shelter at their gates. Secondly, it was spiritual. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided the lives of many monks, emphasized manual labor as a form of prayer and penance. Working the land was seen as a way to connect with God through his creation, to humble oneself before the natural world, and to contribute to the well-being of the community. It was, in essence, applied theology. Think of it this way: each seed planted, each row hoed, each apple picked, became an act of devotion. It wasn't just work, it was worship. A constant, tangible reminder of God's bounty and their dependence on him. And really, doesn't that sound nice, to find that sort of connection to faith in nature and work? Now, let's talk about these gardens themselves. They were far from haphazard affairs. Monastic gardens were carefully planned and organized, reflecting the monks' orderly approach to life. We see three primary types: the hortus, the herb garden, and the cloister garth. The hortus was essentially the kitchen garden, the workhorse of the monastic agricultural system. This is where they cultivated vegetables like beans, peas, onions, leeks, cabbage, and root crops like carrots and turnips. These were the staples of the monastic diet, providing sustenance throughout the year. Imagine these monks, clad in their woolen habits, diligently tilling the soil, planting seeds, and weeding rows upon rows of vegetables. It was grueling work, but they approached it with dedication and precision, knowing that their survival depended on their efforts. Then there was the herb garden, or herbularius. This wasn't just about food, it was about medicine. Monks were often the primary caregivers in their communities, responsible for treating the sick and injured, and their medicine cabinet, the herb garden. These weren't just any old weeds, mind you. These were carefully selected and cultivated plants with medicinal properties. Things like sage, rosemary, thyme, mint, lavender, and chamomile. Each plant had its specific use, known through centuries of herbal lore, passed down through generations of monks. They used these herbs to create remedies for everything from headaches and stomachaches to wounds and infections. Think of them as medieval pharmacists, carefully measuring and mixing ingredients to create salves, tinctures, and teas. It's actually fascinating to think they were practicing folk medicine in a very spiritual and dedicated way, isn't it? And finally, there was the cloister garth. This was the enclosed garden within the monastery's cloister, a place for contemplation and relaxation. It was often planted with flowers, ornamental trees, and perhaps a small fountain or fish pond. The cloister garth was a sanctuary, a green oasis amidst the stone walls of the monastery, a place where monks could escape the rigors of their daily routine, reflect on their spiritual lives, and reconnect with the beauty of the natural world. But it wasn't just about growing food and medicine. Monks also practiced horticulture, the art of cultivating fruits, nuts, and ornamental plants. Monastic orchards were renowned for their variety and quality of fruit, including apples, pears, plums, cherries, and walnuts. They also experimented with different grafting techniques, developing new varieties of fruit trees and improving existing ones. They were essentially the plant breeders of their day, constantly striving to improve the yield and quality of their crops. And their relationship with the land extended beyond the monastery walls. Many monastic orders owned vast tracts of land, which they leased to tenant farmers. These farmers were responsible for cultivating the land and paying rent to the monastery, providing a valuable source of income. But the monks weren't just landlords, they also played an active role in managing their estates, introducing new farming techniques, improving drainage systems, and promoting sustainable agricultural practices. They were in many ways pioneering agronomists, applying their knowledge and skills to improve the productivity of the land. So you see, the lives of medieval monks were far more complex and multifaceted than we often imagine. They weren't just secluded scholars or pious ascetics. They were also skilled farmers, horticulturists, and land managers, deeply connected to the natural world and committed to self-sufficiency and sustainability. And their gardens, these tranquil havens of green amidst the stone walls of the monastery, were not just sources of food and medicine, but also places of contemplation, connection, and spiritual renewal. They were in essence a reflection of the monk's holistic approach to life, a seamless integration of the physical, the intellectual, and the spiritual. Makes you want to find a peaceful garden to wander in, doesn't it? Alright, let's settle in, shall we? Time to turn the page to a particularly fascinating aspect of monastic life, the monastic libraries. Imagine for a moment a room filled with the scent of old parchment and beeswax, a sanctuary of silence broken only by the gentle turning of pages. These weren't your modern-day, brightly lit public libraries. These were something different, something almost sacred. The monastic library wasn't just a place to store books, it was the very heart of intellectual life within the monastery. Think of them as the original hard drive, storing not just data, but the collective wisdom of centuries. They housed everything from religious texts, of course, Bibles, commentaries, the writings of the Church Fathers, to works of classical literature, philosophy, science, and even medicine. Now, many of these monks, let's be honest, weren't exactly thrilled about reading some old pagan philosopher. But in many cases, they understood the value of preserving these texts. After all, who else would do it? These libraries were built book by book, often through painstaking effort. Monks would copy manuscripts by hand in the scriptorium, a dedicated writing room, a process that could take months, even years, for a single book. Think about that dedication. Imagine copying a massive tome, letter by letter, knowing that any mistake would mean starting over. But these libraries weren't just about preserving the past, were also about learning. Monks studied the texts in their collections, debated their meaning, and used them to inform their own spiritual and intellectual development. They were, in a way, early scholars, contributing to the ongoing conversation of knowledge. Now here's where things get a little spicy. These libraries weren't always filled with purely wholesome, uplifting material. Oh no, there were whispers, rumors of forbidden knowledge. You see, alongside the religious texts, some libraries contained works considered, well, let's just say controversial by the church authorities. We're talking about texts on astrology, alchemy, even magic. Books that promised to unlock the secrets of the universe, to control the elements, or even to communicate with, well, other entities. Now, these weren't exactly the kinds of things the church wanted circulating freely. After all, independent thought could lead to heresy, and that just wouldn't do. So how did these controversial texts end up in monastic libraries? Well, there are a few possibilities. First, some monks were simply curious. They were human beings, after all, with a natural desire to learn and explore. And let's face it, forbidden knowledge is always tempting, isn't it? Second, some monasteries, especially those with strong intellectual traditions, saw value in studying a wide range of perspectives, even those considered heretical. They believed that by understanding these alternative viewpoints, they could better defend their own beliefs. And third, sometimes these texts were simply acquired by accident, perhaps through a donation from a wealthy patron who didn't quite understand the implications of what they were giving. Oh, this old book? Don't mind the summoning spells, dear monks. Just pop it on the shelf. There's a good chaps. But the presence of these controversial texts raises some interesting questions, doesn't it? What did the monks do with them? Did they actually use them? Did they try to cast spells or perform alchemical experiments? Well, we can't know for sure. Monks weren't exactly known for blogging about their occult activities, but it's certainly intriguing to imagine them huddled around ancient texts, whispering incantations by candlelight, hoping to unlock the secrets of the universe. The thing is, the church was very aware of the potential for shenanigans, so they implemented various measures to control the flow of information within monasteries. Some texts were kept under lock and key, accessible only to a select few. Others were simply banned outright, deemed too dangerous for anyone to read. And of course, there were instances of books being purged, shall we say, burned, shredded, or otherwise destroyed to prevent their dangerous ideas from spreading. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? All that potential knowledge lost. But even with these restrictions, the monastic library remained a space of intellectual ferment, a place where ideas could be explored, debated, and preserved. It was a testament to the enduring power of knowledge, even in the face of censorship and control. And that, my friends, is a fascinating glimpse into the secret lives of medieval monks, hidden within the treasures of their libraries. It's a story of dedication, intellectual curiosity, and the enduring struggle between knowledge and power. Pretty interesting for a bunch of sleepy monks, right? Now, let's take a nice deep breath and move on to our next chapter. It's time to discuss monastic hospitality. Alright, let's settle in for this next chapter. We're going to wander down the quiet halls and into the guest quarters because we're talking about monastic hospitality, welcoming pilgrims, travelers, and the obligations of charity. Now, when we think of monasteries, maybe the first thing that pops into your head is monks chanting in Latin, or maybe painstakingly copying ancient texts, and that's definitely a big part of the story. But monasteries were also vital hubs of social welfare in the medieval world. Think of them almost as the medieval equivalent of a roadside inn combined with a social services agency, all rolled into one peaceful package. Because travel in the Middle Ages was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a five-star experience. Roads were often little more than muddy tracks, bandits roamed freely, and finding a safe, clean place to rest your weary head at night, that could be a real challenge. This is where the monasteries stepped in, big time. They offered hospitality as a sacred duty, a cornerstone of their faith. You see, it all stems from the rule of Saint Benedict, which we've touched on before. This rule, practically the operating manual for Western monasticism, explicitly states that all guests who present themselves should be received like Christ himself. Seriously, that's the level of importance they placed on it. Imagine you're a pilgrim, journeying across Europe to visit a holy shrine. Maybe you're on your way to Rome, or Santiago de Compostela. Your journey could take weeks, even months. You're tired, hungry, and probably a little bit grubby. Then, on the horizon, you spot it. The sturdy walls of a monastery, a beacon of hope in a sometimes hostile world. As you approach the gate, you know that you will be welcomed. The Benedictine rule laid down a pretty specific protocol for welcoming guests. The abbot, or another designated monk, would greet you personally with a bow and a blessing. You'd be led inside, offered water to wash your travel-stained feet, a practical kindness, considering the state of medieval roads, and then invited to share a meal with the monks, no questions asked. Now, monastic hospitality wasn't just for pilgrims. It extended to all sorts of travelers, merchants, wandering scholars, even the occasional lost knight. Basically anyone who needed a safe place to stay was welcome. The scale of this operation could be really impressive. Some large monasteries had dedicated guest houses, separate buildings specifically designed to accommodate travelers. These weren't exactly luxury suites, mind you, but they were clean, dry, and offered a degree of privacy that was hard to come by on the road. And for those who couldn't even afford a basic inn, or were simply too poor to make it anywhere, it was everything. The monasteries provided more than just a bed and a meal, though. They offered genuine charity, especially to the poor and the sick. Monks were expected to tend to the needs of their guests, providing medical care, mending clothes, and offering spiritual guidance. Think of it as a comprehensive support system for those in need. Often monasteries maintained almshouses or hospitals within their walls, providing long-term care for the infirm and destitute. And this was critical because you've got to remember, medieval society didn't have the kind of social safety nets we take for granted today. There were no government-funded welfare programs, no national health service. The church, and particularly the monasteries, filled that void, providing a crucial lifeline for the most vulnerable members of society. They gave practical help, sure, but they also offered something just as important: dignity and respect. In a world where poverty was often seen as a sign of moral failing, the monasteries offered a message of compassion and acceptance. Now you might be thinking, okay, this all sounds very noble, but how did the monasteries afford it all? Well, it's a valid question. Monasteries were often wealthy institutions, thanks to land ownership, donations from wealthy patrons, and the fruits of their own labor. But even with these resources, providing hospitality on such a large scale was a significant expense. The monks saw it as an investment, though, both in their own spiritual well-being and in the well-being of society. They believed that by welcoming strangers and caring for the needy, they were serving God and earning merit in heaven. Plus, monastic hospitality wasn't just a one-way street. Guests often brought news and information from the outside world, connecting the cloistered monks to the wider community. Pilgrims told tales of distant lands, merchants shared news of trade and commerce, and wandering scholars brought fresh ideas and perspectives. It also facilitated commerce, in the sense that merchants could travel to trade their wares. Of course, there were downsides too. A constant stream of visitors could disrupt the monks' quiet routines and pose a risk to their seclusion. And there were undoubtedly instances of abuse, people taking advantage of the monastery's generosity. You can't just assume it was all sunshine and roses now. But on the whole, monastic hospitality was a remarkable phenomenon, a testament to the power of faith and compassion in a turbulent era. It provided a vital service to travelers, offered crucial support to the needy, and helped to shape the social and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. So, the next time you picture a medieval monastery, remember that it was more than just a place of prayer and contemplation. It was also a haven for travelers, a refuge for the poor, and a beacon of hope in a world that often felt dark and dangerous. And with that, maybe think of all the quiet corners and spaces there, and drift off to sleep. Alright, let's settle in now, and take a peek at something that might seem a little out of place when we think of monks, money, and specifically, how monasteries, these places dedicated to poverty and piety, actually ended up accumulating quite a bit of wealth. It's a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it? Poverty within affluence. Let's unravel that. Now, remember that these monasteries weren't just a collection of individual hermits. They were complex, self-sustaining communities, often responsible for not just their own well-being, but also the well-being of the surrounding areas. And that, my friends, requires resources. So, how did these vows of poverty square with the often significant land ownership and wealth that monasteries possessed? Well, it's all about perspective, really. Individual monks took vows of personal poverty, meaning they couldn't own personal possessions. Everything belonged to the community. Think of it like a really intense version of communal living, where everyone pools their resources. But the monastery as a whole could, and often did, own extensive lands, buildings, and other assets. These weren't seen as personal luxuries but as necessities for supporting the monastic community, fulfilling its charitable obligations, and importantly, glorifying God. A grand church, a well-stocked library, a productive farm, all these were seen as ways to honor God and serve the community. It's a case of the ends justifying the means, perhaps. The primary source of monastic wealth was without a doubt land. Throughout the medieval period, monasteries acquired vast tracts of land through various means. One common way was through donations from wealthy nobles and rulers. These benefactors, often seeking spiritual merit or simply a place to retire, would gift land to monasteries, along with the peasants who worked it. In return, the monastery might offer prayers for the donor's soul, provide a place for them to be buried, or even offer them a comfortable retirement within the monastery walls. It's a bit like a spiritual investment, wouldn't you say? Another way monasteries acquired land was through careful management and agricultural innovation. Monks, particularly those in the Benedictine order, were expected to work. This wasn't just about keeping busy. It was seen as a form of prayer, a way to connect with God through the act of creation. They became incredibly skilled farmers, implementing new techniques in crop rotation, irrigation, and animal husbandry. Monasteries often had the most productive and well-managed farms in the region, and that meant surplus crops to sell. This agricultural surplus in turn generated income. Monasteries sold their produce at local markets, providing food for the surrounding population and earning money to support their own needs. They also engaged in other economic activities such as brewing beer, raising livestock, and even producing textiles. Think of them as early medieval entrepreneurs, but with a spiritual mission. Now, this wealth didn't always sit well with everyone. The paradox of poverty within affluence was a constant source of tension and criticism. Some argued that monasteries were becoming too worldly, too focused on accumulating wealth and power, and losing sight of their spiritual There were accusations of greed, corruption, and extravagance. And let's be honest, sometimes those accusations were justified. Human nature being what it is, some monasteries did become complacent, prioritizing their own comfort and security over the needs of the poor. Stories of monks indulging in lavish meals, wearing fine clothes, and neglecting their charitable duties certainly circulated. It's all a bit scandalous, really. But it's important to remember that not all monasteries were the same. Some remained true to their ideals of poverty and service, using their resources to help the poor, care for the sick, and promote education. They provided food and shelter for the needy, offered medical care in their infirmaries, and maintained schools for local children. Monasteries also played a crucial role in preserving knowledge and culture. They housed vast libraries, painstakingly copying and preserving ancient texts that would otherwise have been lost. Monks in the Scriptorium illuminated manuscripts, creating beautiful works of art that are still admired today. They also made advances in fields like medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. So were monasteries hypocritical in their wealth? It's a complicated question, and there's no easy answer. They were certainly operating within a system that was rife with inequalities, and they sometimes benefited from that system in ways that seemed contradictory to their vows. But they also used their wealth to do a great deal of good, providing essential services, preserving knowledge, and contributing to the economic development of their regions. It's a paradox, a tension between the ideal and the reality. And that, my friends, is what makes them so endlessly fascinating. It's a reminder that even in the most devout and seemingly simple of communities, the complexities of human nature and the challenges of the world will always find a way to creep in. It's a balancing act, really, between spiritual aspirations and earthly realities. And now, as we settle in for the night, perhaps we can ponder that balance a little more deeply. Sleep well, all right. Settle in a little closer now, because we're about to drift into the stunning world of medieval art and architecture, specifically how monks shaped it all. I always found this to be so relaxing to think about. So you've got these guys, right, living in these quiet, often remote places, but their impact, absolutely huge. We're not just talking about plain stone walls and some stained glass. Oh no, this is about entire movements, new styles, and a lasting influence that echoes even today. Think of the soaring arches of cathedrals, the intricate details of illuminated manuscripts, all touched, shaped, often completely brought to life by monastic hands. Let's start with the big stuff, cathedrals. These weren't just places of worship, they were expressions of faith so immense, they needed to be built big. And who had the organization, the scholarly knowledge, and frankly, the sheer manpower to undertake such monumental projects? Yep, often the monastic orders. Think about the Benedictines. They were masters of planning, organization, and resource management. Their monasteries became centers of learning, attracting skilled craftsmen, stonemasons, and artists. These guys weren't just blindly following plans, they were innovators. They took Romanesque architecture, with its rounded arches and thick walls, and started experimenting. They built higher, longer, and with more light. This led gradually to the Gothic style. Can you picture it? Those pointed arches reaching for the heavens, the ribbed vaults spreading like delicate spiderwebs, the enormous stained glass windows flooding the interior with colored light. Monks weren't just in these cathedrals, they were often designing them. They understood geometry, mathematics, and engineering principles. They knew how to create spaces that inspired awe and reverence. And it wasn't just about the structure itself. Monks commissioned artwork to fill these grand spaces. Sculptures, paintings, tapestries, all designed to educate the illiterate masses and inspire devotion. The images were often symbolic, teaching stories from the Bible or the lives of the saints. Even the placement of these artworks was carefully considered, creating a visual narrative that guided worshippers through their spiritual journey. Now let's zoom in a bit. from the grand cathedrals to the monasteries themselves. These were also carefully designed spaces. Functionality was key, obviously, but aesthetics played a role too. The layout of a typical monastery was very deliberate. The cloister, an enclosed courtyard with covered walkways, was the heart of the complex. This was a place for quiet contemplation and exercise. Around the cloister were arranged the essential buildings: the church, the refectory, where meals were eaten, the dormitory, where the monks slept, the chapter house, where meetings were held, and the library. Even within these buildings, the monks paid attention to detail. The refectory might have frescoes depicting scenes from the Bible, or the life of the monastery's patron saint. The library, of course, was a treasure trove of illuminated manuscripts, each page a work of art in itself. Speaking of illuminated manuscripts, these are a perfect example of how monks expressed their faith through aesthetics. These weren't just copies of texts, they were celebrations of the written word. Monks painstakingly transcribed these texts using calligraphy techniques that had been refined over centuries. But then came the Illumination, the addition of intricate borders, decorative initials, and miniature paintings. These illuminations weren't just pretty pictures, they were often deeply symbolic, reflecting the meaning of the text. The colors used were carefully chosen, with each having its own significance. Gold leaf was used to represent divinity and the heavenly realm. The images themselves might depict scenes from the Bible, the lives of the saints, or even allegorical representations of virtues and vices. The creation of these manuscripts was a slow, painstaking process, often taking years to complete a single volume. It required not only artistic skill, but also deep knowledge of theology, history, and classical literature, and it was all done by hand, with meticulous care and devotion. Think about the Book of Kells, for instance, or the Lindisfarne Gospels. These aren't just books, they're cultural treasures, testaments to the artistic skill and unwavering faith of the monks who created them. And it wasn't just manuscripts. Monks also excelled in other art forms, such as metalwork, jewelry making, and even music. Chanting, Gregorian chants, these were all forms of artistic expression that were developed and nurtured within the monastic setting. They created spaces for the divine that transcended the limits of day-to-day life. So next time you see a stunning cathedral or admire the delicate details of an illuminated manuscript, remember the medieval monks. They were more than just men of prayer. They were architects, artists, and innovators who left an indelible mark on the world of art and aesthetics. Their faith, expressed through their creations, continues to inspire awe and wonder to this very day. Now, isn't that a calming thought to carry with you into sleep? Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to delve into a part of monastic life that wasn't always so serene. Beneath those peaceful chants and quiet cloisters, monasteries could be surprisingly, well, let's just say dynamic. You see, stuffing a bunch of men, and I do mean men, with all their inherent complexities into a closed community for life is bound to create some friction. Think of it like a pressure cooker of personalities, ambitions, and yes, even simmering resentments. One of the most common sources of conflict, good old-fashioned power struggles. Monasteries, especially the larger and wealthier ones, weren't exactly democracies. Authority flowed from the abbot, that's the head honcho, on down. And surprise, surprise, not everyone agreed with the abbot's every decision. Now, these weren't usually open rebellions. Nobody wants to get kicked out. But there were plenty of subtle ways to challenge an abbot's power. Perhaps a senior monk might interpret the rule of Saint Benedict, their sort of Bible of behavior, in a way that conveniently benefited his own faction. Maybe another would subtly undermine the abbot's authority by questioning his judgment in front of the other monks. Think of it as medieval passive-aggressive behavior at its finest. Succession was a particularly fertile ground for conflict. Who would be the next abbot? Elections weren't always fair, and sometimes powerful families from the outside world would try to influence the outcome, backing their favorite monk with promises of donations or political favors. Imagine the tension, the whispered campaigns, the maybe not so subtle political maneuvering. It was basically medieval House of Cards, just with more prayer and less Kevin Spacey. And then of course there were the personal disputes, because spoiler alert, monks were people. They had their own quirks, their own pet peeves, and their own, shall we say, unique personalities. Maybe Brother Thomas snored louder than a blacksmith's forge. Maybe Brother Benedict always borrowed parchment and never returned it. Or maybe Brother Francis just had a really annoying habit of humming during prayers. These might seem like minor annoyances, but when you're living in close quarters with the same people, day in and day out, those little things can start to feel like, well, major irritations. And let's not forget, these were often men who had given up worldly ambitions, but that didn't necessarily mean they'd given up ambition altogether. There was still a hierarchy within the monastery, positions of authority and influence to be gained. The precentor, the one in charge of chanting, for example, or the cellarer, the guy in charge of supplies, including food. These were important positions, and monks might compete fiercely for them. Sometimes these competitions were healthy, pushing monks to excel in their duties, but sometimes they could lead to jealousy, backstabbing, and even, in rare cases, violence. We're not talking sword fights in the cloister or anything, though wouldn't that be a movie, but more like, say, a strategically placed tripping hazard in a dark corridor. Another big challenge, and one that's relevant to pretty much any communal living situation, was just the sheer difficulty of living in such close proximity to so many people. Remember, these monasteries could house dozens, even hundreds of monks. That's a lot of different personalities to manage, a lot of different needs to accommodate. The rule of Saint Benedict, while wise and well-intentioned, couldn't possibly cover every single potential conflict. It provided a framework, but it was up to the abbot and the monks themselves to work out the details, to negotiate, to compromise. And let's be honest, not everyone was particularly good at negotiating or compromising. And then there was the emotional toll of monastic life itself. The strict schedule, the lack of privacy, the constant demands of prayer and work, all of this could take a toll on a monk's mental and emotional well-being. Some monks struggled with feelings of isolation, loneliness, or even despair. Remember, most of these men had entered the monastery at a relatively young age, often leaving behind families, friends, and worldly aspirations. Some may have genuinely felt called to a life of prayer and contemplation. Others may have been pressured into it by their families, or simply seen it as a way to escape a difficult or uncertain future. Regardless of their initial motivations, the realities of monastic life could be challenging, and not every monk was able to cope with them successfully. Some might turn to alcohol or other forbidden pleasures to numb the pain. Others might become withdrawn and isolated, struggling with depression and anxiety. And let's not forget the very real threat of boredom. Okay, maybe that sounds trivial, but imagine doing the same thing, day after day, year after year, with little to no change in scenery or routine. Even the most devout monk might start to feel a little stir-crazy after a while. This boredom could manifest in all sorts of ways. Some monks might become obsessed with minor details, like the precise arrangement of candles on the altar, or the proper way to fold their habits. Others might engage in petty gossip or practical jokes, just to break the monotony. And others may start to think of ways of adding to their meals. Of course, the best monasteries had systems in place to deal with these kinds of problems. Confession, where monks could admit their faults and seek guidance from their superiors, was an important tool. So was the practice of spiritual direction, where monks could meet with a more experienced monk to discuss their spiritual struggles and receive advice. But even with these safeguards in place, conflicts were inevitable. Monasteries, despite their outward appearance of serenity, were complex and often turbulent communities, full of the same human foibles and failings that you'd find anywhere else. And that's what makes them so fascinating. Because beneath the robes and the rituals, these were just men, struggling to live together, to find meaning in their lives, and to navigate the challenges of communal living. Alright, settle in a little deeper, make sure you're comfy. We're now going to peek behind the pious facade and explore some of the more human moments within the monasteries. Let's talk about breaking the rules, shall we? Because even behind those imposing stone walls, human nature, well, it just couldn't always be contained. The image of a monk, as we've discussed, is one of unwavering devotion, a life of prayer and sacrifice, and for many, that was their reality. But let's be honest, putting a group of men, and it was mostly men, together in a closed environment, with relatively strict rules and, well, a lot of free time, things were bound to get a little complicated sometimes. One of the most common, and perhaps most relatable, infractions was good old-fashioned drunkenness. Now, monasteries were often responsible for producing wine, both for sacramental purposes and as a beverage, since, you know, clean drinking water could be a bit of a gamble back then. So, the temptation was always there. And while a little wine to gladden the heart was generally accepted, some monks, let's just say they really took that verse to heart. Chroniclers of the time, often monks themselves, who, let's face it, loved a good gossip sesh, tell tales of monks found stumbling around the cloister, slurring their prayers, and generally behaving in a manner unbecoming a man of God. There are even accounts of entire monasteries descending into drunken revelry, particularly around feast days, when the wine flowed a little too freely. Picture it: solemn chants replaced with off-key singing, whispered confessions replaced with loud boasts, and pious walks replaced by, well, less than graceful stumbles. It's almost comical, isn't it? And it wasn't just wine. Some monasteries were also known for brewing beer or cider, and those too could become instruments of monastic misbehavior. There are even records of monks sneaking out to local taverns for a stronger brew, risking not only their vows but also potential encounters with, shall we say, less savory characters from the outside world. Oh, the things they must have seen, and the stories they brought back. Then of course there's the sin of gluttony. Now, the monastic diet, as we've touched on, was supposed to be simple and moderate, designed to nourish the body without indulging the senses. But human appetite is a powerful thing, and some monks, well, they clearly had a bit of a weakness for, shall we say, extra helpings. Accounts from monastic life reveal monks hoarding food, sneaking into the kitchen for midnight snacks, and even engaging in, well, let's call it creative culinary endeavors. Imagine a monk, supposed to be fasting, sneaking a roasted chicken from the kitchens, hiding it under his habit, and feasting on it in his cell. The aroma alone would betray him. The rules regarding food were complex, and often contradictory. There were fast days when only bread and water were permitted, and feast days when meat and other delicacies were allowed. But even on feast days, moderation was key, and it seems some monks struggled with the concept of just one more slice. Beyond overindulgence in approved foods, there were also instances of monks consuming forbidden items. Meat was often restricted, especially the meat of four-legged animals, but records show monks finding creative ways around the rules. Some argued that beaver was a fish because it lived in the water, thus making it permissible to eat even on fast days. Clever, aren't they? I think they must have just wanted to eat beaver. But it wasn't just about food and drink. There were other rules too, designed to maintain order and discipline within the cloister. Rules about silence, about personal possessions, about interactions with the outside world. And these rules too were sometimes bent, shall we say. The rule of silence, for example, was meant to promote contemplation and spiritual focus. But try telling a group of chatty individuals to remain quiet all day. Monks naturally found ways to communicate through gestures, through whispered conversations, and even through secret codes. And of course, sometimes they just plain talked. Imagine the hushed gossip echoing through the cloisters, the forbidden jokes, the sharing of secrets. You know they were talking about something. I wish I knew what it was. The rule against personal possessions was intended to foster a spirit of poverty and detachment from worldly goods. But some monks, well, they seem to have a hard time letting go of their earthly attachments. Accounts reveal monks hoarding books, trinkets, and even pets. Imagine a monk secretly caring for a stray cat in his cell, feeding it scraps and keeping it hidden from the abbot. The things we do for love. And then there were the rules about interactions with the outside world. Monks were supposed to remain within the confines of the monastery, dedicated to prayer and study. But some monks, well, they clearly had a bit of wanderlust. There are stories of monks sneaking out to visit local villages, to attend fairs, or even just to explore the surrounding countryside. These clandestine excursions, of course, risked not only disciplinary action, but also exposure to worldly temptations. Imagine a monk, raised in the sheltered environment of the monastery, encountering the sights, sounds, and sensations of the outside world. It must have been quite a shock to the system. Now, it's important to remember that these infractions were not universal. Many monks did live lives of genuine devotion and adherence to the rules, but the existence of these stories tells us something important about human nature. Even in the most restrictive environments, human desires, appetites, and curiosities can find a way to express themselves, and perhaps that's what makes these stories so relatable. We all have our own struggles with temptation, our own moments of weakness, our own, let's call them less than perfect choices. And knowing that even medieval monks, supposedly paragons of virtue, were not immune to these struggles, well, it makes them seem a little more human, doesn't it? And perhaps a little less boring. Now, let's move on to a topic that is a little more juicy. Alright, settle in, friends. It's time to tiptoe into a subject that probably raised a few eyebrows back in the medieval monastery. The old temptation of the flesh, sexuality, celibacy, and the occasional, shall we say, unauthorized romance. Z's. Now, before we dive in, let's remember what we're dealing with. These monks weren't just randomly plucked from the fields. They made a conscious choice, a vow. One of the big ones was chastity, meaning abstaining from sexual activity. This wasn't just about, doing the deed. It was about controlling desires, focusing that energy on God, and keeping the community pure. Easier said than done, right? The thing is, humans are humans. Whether you're wearing a burlap robe or a business suit, those urges are still there. And when you're living in close quarters with other people, cut off from the outside world, well, things can get interesting. Monasteries were intended to be havens of spiritual purity, but they were also all-male societies, which, let's be honest, could create its own set of problems. Think about it. Young men, often in their prime, living, working, and praying together, all while trying to suppress very natural desires. It was kind of a pressure cooker, if you think about it. Official records about these sorts of transgressions are unsurprisingly sparse. You're not going to find monks openly advertising their romantic exploits in the abbey's newsletter, but if you know where to look, you can find hints, whispers, and outright accusations scattered throughout history. One of the biggest challenges was the simple boredom. The daily routine, while structured, could also be incredibly monotonous. Prayer, study, work, sleep, repeat. This lack of stimulation, coupled with the suppression of natural desires, could lead to all sorts of internal struggles. And then there was the matter of human connection. Monks were supposed to be devoted to God, but they were still social creatures. Forming close friendships was natural, but those friendships could on occasion blossom into something more. Platonic affection could easily morph into something a little less platonic, especially in the hothouse environment of the monastery. So what happened when monks broke their vows? Well, the consequences could range from a slap on the wrist to something far more severe. Minor infractions like, say, a little too much lingering eye contact with a particularly handsome brother might warrant a stern talking to or some extra prayers as penance. But more serious offenses, like actual sexual activity, were a different story. Depending on the order and the era, punishments could include flogging, imprisonment, or even expulsion from the monastery. And, let's not forget, in some cases the secular authorities might get involved, leading to even harsher penalties. Now, I know what you're thinking. Weren't these guys supposed to be holy men? Well, yes, ideally, but they were also flawed humans struggling with their own imperfections, and the system itself wasn't always set up for success. The idea of celibacy as a mandatory requirement for priesthood or monastic life is a complex issue that has evolved over time. It wasn't always the norm, and it's been a source of debate and controversy throughout church history. Putting young men and women in convents, of course, let's not forget them, in a situation where they're constantly battling their own nature, and then punishing them severely when they falter, seems almost designed to create problems. Cases of forbidden love in the monastic world often involved a complicated web of emotions, power dynamics, and societal pressures. It wasn't always just about lust. Sometimes it was about loneliness, a yearning for connection, or a rebellion against the rigid rules of the cloister. Think about a young novice, fresh from the outside world, struggling to adapt to the austere life of the monastery. He might find solace and companionship in another monk, someone who understands his struggles and offers him support. That bond, born out of shared experience, could easily deepen into something more intimate. And then there were the cases where power imbalances came into play. A senior monk might take advantage of a younger, more vulnerable brother, using his authority to manipulate or coerce him into a relationship. This kind of abuse was sadly not unheard of, and it highlights the dark side of monastic life. Of course, not all forbidden loves were between monks. Sometimes the temptation came from outside the monastery walls. Monks interacted with the outside world to varying degrees, whether it was tending to the monastery's lands, providing charity to the poor, or welcoming pilgrims and travelers. These interactions could lead to encounters with women, and well, you can imagine the rest. There are tales, often apocryphal, of secret tunnels leading from monasteries to nearby villages, facilitating clandestine meetings between monks and local women. These stories may be more legend than fact, but they speak to the enduring allure of forbidden romance. What's really interesting is the contrast with the official narrative. The church preached against sin, the monks took vows of chastity, and yet, human nature always found a way. It's a reminder that even in the most regulated and controlled environments, the human heart is unpredictable and often uncontrollable. And so sometimes the monks strayed, adding more layers to the complexities of monastic life. Ziz. Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to delve into a more complex area of monastic life. It's not all illuminated manuscripts and Gregorian chants, you know. Tonight, we're talking heresy and dissent within the hallowed halls of monasteries. Think of a monastery as a pressure cooker, right? You have all these intelligent, driven individuals, often from different social strata, crammed together in a closed environment. They're all theoretically dedicated to the same ideals, but human nature, well, it tends to complicate things. And when you have people really thinking and debating and studying texts for hours every day, disagreements are bound to arise. Now, before we go any further, let's define heresy, at least for our purposes. Essentially, it's the holding of religious opinions that contradict established church doctrine. And back in the medieval period, that was a big deal. We're talking excommunication, potential torture, even being burned at the stake, big deal. So you'd think monks of all people would be the least likely to stray from the straight and narrow theological path, right? They've taken vows of obedience, they're surrounded by religious texts, they're constantly praying, But surprisingly, that wasn't always the case. Why? Well, for starters, these guys were scholars. They were constantly studying the Bible, the Church Fathers, and other theological works. And the more you read, the more you might start to question things. Maybe a particular passage seems contradictory, or perhaps a specific doctrine just doesn't sit right with your conscience. Remember, many of these monks were brilliant men, capable of complex and independent thought. The very act of intense study could lead to intellectual curiosity that over time veers away from strict orthodoxy. Plus, there were the practical realities of monastic life. Monasteries, despite their vows of poverty, often became quite wealthy, accumulating land, serfs, and valuable possessions. This created a tension. How could these communities dedicated to humility and self-denial justify their affluence while so much of the world outside the cloister suffered in poverty? This disparity, this perceived hypocrisy, could fuel dissent, leading some monks to question the church's teachings on wealth and power. And it wasn't just about questioning doctrine, it was also about challenging authority. Monasteries were hierarchical societies. The abbot was the supreme ruler, and his word was law. But what if the abbot was corrupt? What if he was abusing his power, favoring certain monks over others, or mismanaging the monastery's resources? Dissent could manifest as open rebellion, with monks refusing to obey the abbot's orders, or even attempting to depose him. Now, those kinds of power struggles were often more about politics than theology, but the end result was the same, a challenge to the established order. One prominent example of monastic dissent comes from the Franciscan order. Now, Franciscans, you might recall, took vows of absolute poverty. They were supposed to own nothing, either individually or as a community. But over time, many Franciscan monasteries began to accumulate wealth despite their founders' intentions. This led to a major split within the order, between the spirituals, who insisted on strict adherence to Francis's original vision, and the conventuals, who were more willing to compromise with the realities of wealth and power. This internal conflict eventually led to some spiritual Franciscans being condemned as heretics and even executed. Can you imagine brothers turning on each other over interpretations of their own shared rule? Another source of dissent stemmed from the rise of mystical movements within the church. Mysticism, generally speaking, emphasizes direct personal experience of God, rather than relying solely on church dogma and ritual. Now, mysticism isn't necessarily heretical. In fact, many great saints were mystics, but it could become problematic if mystics started claiming that their personal revelations superseded church teaching, or that they had achieved a level of spiritual enlightenment that made them superior to other believers. In a monastery setting, these mystical tendencies could lead to clashes with the abbot and with more traditional members of the community. And let's not forget the risks associated with independent thought itself. The church valued conformity, and any deviation from the established norm was viewed with suspicion. Monks who expressed unorthodox ideas, even if they weren't deliberately trying to challenge church doctrine, could find themselves accused of heresy. All it took was a few disgruntled brothers whispering accusations to the abbot, and suddenly you're facing an investigation, potential imprisonment, or even expulsion from the monastery. Talk about a stressful work environment. The consequences of heresy were severe. At best, a dissenting monk might be subjected to public penance, forced to fast, pray, and endure humiliation in order to atone for his sins. At worst, he could be handed over to the secular authorities for punishment, which could include imprisonment, torture, and, as I mentioned earlier, being burned at the stake. This last one, a particularly effective deterrent, wouldn't you say? So why risk it? Why would a monk, knowing the potential consequences, choose to challenge church doctrine or defy monastic authority? Well, for some, it was a matter of conscience. They simply couldn't reconcile their beliefs with the teachings of the church, and they felt compelled to speak out, regardless of the cost. For others, it was a matter of intellectual integrity. They believed that the pursuit of truth was more important than blind obedience, and they were willing to risk everything in that pursuit. And then, of course, there were those motivated by power, resentment, or simply a desire to shake things up. Whatever the reasons, heresy and dissent were a constant undercurrent in monastic life. These weren't always huge, dramatic events. More often, they were subtle acts of defiance, a whispered criticism of the abbot, a refusal to participate in a particular ritual, a questioning glance during a theological debate. But these small acts of resistance, repeated over time, could have a significant impact, challenging the authority of the church and contributing to the ongoing process of religious reform. So the next time you think of medieval monks, don't just picture them as quiet, obedient scribes. Remember that they were also complex individuals, capable of independent thought, dissent, and even heresy, and that their struggles with faith, authority, and conscience played an important role in shaping the religious landscape of the medieval world. Now, close your eyes and imagine being there, in that cold, quiet room with them, thinking, pondering, and perhaps just a little bit questioning too. It is so quiet, so calm, so peaceful. Sleep well. Okay, so monasteries weren't always heavens of pure spirituality and scholarly pursuits. While many monks genuinely dedicated their lives to God, human nature, well, it has a funny way of creeping in, even behind the thickest stone walls. This is where we peel back a few more layers, and things get a little less angelic. Accusations of corruption, abuse of power, and unexplained deaths. They weren't exactly everyday occurrences, but they did happen. And when they did, they could shake the very foundations of the monastic order. Let's start with corruption. Now remember, we talked about monastic economics, land ownership, wealth, that whole paradox of poverty within affluence. Well, that's where things could get a bit sticky. Some abbots, the heads of the monasteries, started to see their positions as opportunities for personal gain rather than spiritual leadership. I mean, imagine having control over vast estates, serfs, and a constant flow of income. The temptation, it must have been pretty significant. Using monastic resources to benefit their own families. Simona, the buying and selling of church offices, that was a big one. You might have a wealthy nobleman who, shall we say, encourages his son to join the monastery, perhaps with a generous donation, to ensure he rises quickly through the ranks. Suddenly, you've got someone in a position of power who is there because of money, not piety. It's not a great recipe for moral purity, is it? And it wasn't just the abbots. You had cellars responsible for managing the monastery's provisions, who might skim off the top, selling surplus food for personal profit. Or priors, second in command, who might engage in their own little schemes of embezzlement. It wasn't every monk, of course, but the opportunities were there, and some yielded to temptation. Then you get into the abuse of power. Monasteries were hierarchical societies, and where you have hierarchy, you often have bullying. Abbots again held immense power over their monks. They could assign the most menial tasks, restrict privileges, or even inflict physical punishment. Now, discipline was considered essential in monastic life, a way to curb the flesh and focus on the spirit. But sometimes discipline crossed the line into outright abuse. We're talking about monks being unfairly punished for minor infractions, being denied food or sleep, or even being physically beaten. And if you were a lower-ranking monk, who were you going to complain to? The abbot himself? It was a system ripe for exploitation. And then there were the uncomfortable accusations, whispers of sexual abuse within the cloister. This is, of course, a very sensitive topic, and it's important to remember that accusations don't equal proof. But the historical records do contain instances of monks being accused of abusing their positions of authority to take advantage of younger or more vulnerable members of the community. These accusations were often hushed up, covered over by the church hierarchy, making it nearly impossible to know the true extent of the problem. But the fact that these whispers existed, it casts a long shadow. Now, the really unsettling part, unexplained deaths. Monasteries, especially the larger and wealthier ones, were often shrouded in secrecy. And when someone died unexpectedly, well, rumors would start to swirl. Was it illness, an accident, or something more sinister? Think about it. You have a closed community, often isolated from the outside world. You have power struggles, jealousies and resentments simmering beneath the surface. You have access to poisons. Remember, monks were often skilled in herbal medicine, and many herbs can be deadly. And you have a motive. Someone who stood in the way of another's ambition. Someone who knew too much. Someone who threatened to expose corruption. The historical records are understandably vague on this topic. You might find an entry in a monastic chronicle noting that brother so-and-so died suddenly after a brief illness, but you'll rarely find details. No autopsies, no investigations, just silence. Of course, it's easy to let our imaginations run wild. The vast majority of deaths in monasteries were probably from natural causes, disease, old age, accidents. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly stellar, even for monks. But the possibility of foul play, it adds another layer of darkness to the monastic story. And it's important to say that these accusations, this dark side, didn't go unnoticed by contemporaries. There were reformers, both within the church and outside it, who criticized the corruption and abuses within monastic orders. They called for stricter adherence to the monastic rule, for greater accountability, and for a return to the original ideals of poverty, chastity, and obedience. These calls for reform often met with resistance. Powerful abbots and wealthy monasteries weren't exactly eager to give up their privileges and wealth. But the criticisms persisted, and they played a role in the eventual decline of monasticism in some parts of Europe. So what does all this mean? Does it mean that all monks were corrupt or abusive? Absolutely not. The vast majority were probably genuinely devout men who lived lives of prayer, work, and study. But it does mean that the image of the perfect, peaceful monastery, it's a bit of a fantasy. Monks were human beings, with all the flaws and frailties that come with it. And sometimes, those flaws led to corruption, abuse, and even perhaps to death. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? One that reminds us that even in the most sacred spaces, darkness can sometimes creep in. Alright, settle in friends, because we're about to delve into the surprisingly messy world of medieval monasteries and their interactions with, well, everyone else. You might think of these places as isolated havens of prayer, but the truth is, monasteries were deeply involved in the political and economic life of their time. Think of them less as silent retreats, and more as powerful corporations with divine branding. So let's talk politics. Monasteries, especially the larger, wealthier ones, owned vast tracts of land. We're talking prime agricultural real estate, forests, even entire villages. This gave them significant economic power, which naturally translated into political influence. Kings and nobles knew that keeping the monasteries on their good side was essential for maintaining stability and generating wealth within their kingdoms. After all, who better to manage large estates, collect taxes, tithes in this case, and provide loans than these highly organized, literate, and relatively trustworthy monastic communities? This brings us to the concept of patronage. Monasteries relied heavily on the generosity of wealthy benefactors, kings, queens, dukes, counts, you name it. These patrons would donate land, money, jewels, and other valuable items to the monastery in exchange for, well, a few things. Firstly, prayers. The monks would offer up daily prayers for the patron's soul, both in life and after death. This was seen as a vital service, ensuring a smoother passage to heaven and a shorter stay in purgatory. Think of it as divine life insurance. Secondly, patronage brought prestige. Associating oneself with a successful and respected monastery enhanced the patron's own reputation. Building a new chapel within the monastery, donating a magnificent stained glass window, or even just being seen attending mass there. These were all ways for nobles to signal their piety, wealth, and good taste. It was a win-win situation. The monastery got resources, and the patron got good PR in a decidedly medieval sort of way. Now all this patronage came with strings attached. Patrons often expected to have a say in the monastery's affairs. They might try to influence the election of the abbot, request special favors for their relatives, or even demand that the monastery support their political agenda. This could lead to all sorts of conflicts, both within the monastery and between the monastery and the outside world. Imagine the abbot trying to balance the spiritual needs of his community with the demands of a powerful and potentially ruthless king. Not an easy task, let me tell you. And that brings us to the really juicy part: royal interference. Kings in particular had a habit of sticking their noses into monastic business. They saw monasteries as valuable assets, both economically and politically, and they wanted to control them. One common way to exert control was through the appointment of abbots. Technically, the monks were supposed to elect their own leader, but kings often suggested a candidate, usually someone loyal to the crown. If the monks refused to cooperate, well, things could get unpleasant. Royal favors could be withdrawn, land could be seized, and the monastery could find itself facing all sorts of legal and financial difficulties. Sometimes, kings even went a step further and appointed lay abbots, individuals who were not monks at all, but were simply royal officials or favored nobles. These lay abbots often had little interest in the spiritual life of the monastery and were primarily concerned with exploiting its resources for their own benefit. Imagine a CEO being appointed to lead a monastery. Sounds crazy, right? But it happened. This royal interference could have devastating consequences for monastic life. Monks might find themselves forced to support unpopular policies, embroiled in political intrigues, or even drawn into armed conflicts. The spiritual discipline of the monastery could suffer, and the community could become divided and demoralized. It's a bit like having your workplace micromanaged by someone who doesn't understand or care about what you do. And speaking of royal interference, let's not forget about the issue of taxation. Monasteries, despite their claims of poverty, were often incredibly wealthy, and kings were always looking for ways to tap into that wealth. They might impose special taxes on monasteries, demand loans, or even confiscate monastic property under various pretexts. This was a constant source of tension between the crown and the monastic orders, and it could lead to bitter disputes and even open defiance. Think of it this way: monasteries were like honeypots, attracting the attention of powerful and often greedy rulers. They had to navigate a complex web of political alliances, patronage relationships, and royal demands in order to survive and maintain their independence. It was a far cry from the serene, isolated life that we often imagine. So, next time you picture a medieval monk, don't just think of him as a quiet scholar or a devout prayer. Think of him as a player in a complex game of power, a negotiator dealing with kings and nobles, a manager overseeing vast estates, and a defender of his community's interests in a world where politics and religion were inextricably intertwined. It adds a whole new layer of intrigue, doesn't it? And it also explains why monastic life was sometimes, well, a bit less than saintly. But we'll get to that later. Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to delve into a pretty turbulent time for our monastic friends. We're talking about the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. Now Henry, bless his heart, wasn't exactly known for his subtlety, and when he decided he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, well, things got complicated. You see, the Pope wasn't exactly on board with the whole divorce the Queen thing, which put Henry in a bit of a pickle, a religious pickle, if you will. This wasn't just about getting a new wife, though. Henry saw the church, and specifically the monasteries, as a bit of a problem. They were wealthy, powerful, and ultimately loyal to Rome, not to him. And a king likes loyalty, especially when he's going against the Pope. So what's a king to do? Well, if you're Henry VIII, you declare yourself the supreme head of the Church of England, effectively kicking the Pope to the curb. Suddenly, he's in charge of all things religious in England. Neat trick, right? But that was just the beginning. Henry needed more than just religious control. He needed money, and those monasteries, they were practically overflowing with it. Land, gold, jewels, you name it, they had it. It was like a giant piggy bank, just begging to be cracked open. Enter Thomas Cromwell, Henry's right-hand man. Cromwell was a shrewd operator, a master of bureaucracy, and not afraid to get his hands dirty. He was tasked with carrying out Henry's grand plan, the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the dissolution, let's be clear, it wasn't like Henry just woke up one morning and decided to shut them all down overnight. It was a process, a carefully orchestrated campaign that unfolded over several years. First, Cromwell ordered a survey of all the monasteries in England. Officially, this was to assess their value and ensure they were being properly run. Unofficially, it was a thinly veiled excuse to find dirt on them. And find dirt they did. Cromwell's commissioners, these were guys sent to do the dirty work of fact-finding, went around visiting the monasteries. And guess what? When people have an agenda, it tends to surface. Stories started surfacing of, well, pretty bad stuff. Tales of corruption, mismanagement, and even, gasp, scandalous behavior. Monks breaking their vows, indulging in worldly pleasures, you know, the whole shebang. Now, how much of this was true? Probably some. Were the reports exaggerated to justify the dissolution? Almost certainly. Based on these reports, Henry began with the smaller monasteries. In 1536, Parliament passed the Act of Suppression, dissolving monasteries with an annual income of less than £200. This affected hundreds of smaller monastic houses. Their lands and possessions were seized by the crown. Now imagine you're a monk living in one of these smaller monasteries. One day, government officials show up at your door, tell you your home is being shut down and you're being kicked out. Where do you go? What do you do? It must have been a terrifying and disorienting experience. But Henry wasn't done yet. Oh no, he had his sights set on the larger, wealthier monasteries too. Over the next few years, he used a combination of legal pressure, intimidation, and outright force to persuade the abbots and priors of these larger houses to surrender their monasteries to the crown. Some cooperated willingly, perhaps hoping to curry favor with the king. Others resisted, but resistance was often futile. Those who resisted faced accusations of treason, and some were even executed. It was a brutal and ruthless process, and by 1541, virtually all the monasteries in England had been dissolved. Their lands, their wealth, their libraries, all seized by the crown. So, what happened to all that stuff? Well, much of it went straight into Henry's coffers, helping to fund his lavish lifestyle and his various military campaigns. Some of the land was sold off to wealthy nobles, creating a new class of landowners loyal to the crown. And what about the monks and nuns who were displaced? Some were given pensions, but these were often meager and insufficient to support them. Others were simply turned out onto the streets, left to fend for themselves. It was a devastating blow to monastic life, a way of life that had existed in England for centuries. Now, it wasn't all doom and gloom. Some monastic churches were repurposed as parish churches, saving them from destruction. Some monastic libraries were preserved, helping to safeguard valuable books and manuscripts. But overall, the dissolution of the monasteries represented a huge loss of cultural and religious heritage. It also had a profound impact on English society. Monasteries had played a vital role in providing education, healthcare, and poor relief. With their dissolution, these services were disrupted, leaving many people vulnerable. It was in a way a sort of early form of social service in England, a function of the church, not the state as we have today. But with the stroke of a pen and a few well-placed accusations, it was all dissolved. And perhaps the most lasting legacy of the dissolution of the monasteries was the shift in power. Henry VIII had not only secured his divorce and his religious authority, but he had also amassed immense wealth and created a new class of loyal landowners. It was a power grab of epic proportions, and it forever changed the course of English history. So next time you are drifting off, remember the secrets within the stones of these fallen churches. Okay, let's gently settle in and drift into a realm beyond just survival, beyond those tough landscapes we've been talking about. Let's consider what these sometimes grumpy, often rule-breaking, but secretly brilliant monks left behind. It's a legacy that echoes even today, a ripple in the pond of time, you might say. Think about it. These weren't just guys in robes chanting and copying books, though they did plenty of that. They were also artists, scientists, agricultural innovators, and in many ways the social safety net of their time. Let's start with art. Now, we've touched on the scriptorium, right? Those havens of calligraphy, where monks painstakingly copied and illuminated manuscripts. But it wasn't just about preservation. These manuscripts, folks, were art. The vibrant colors, the intricate designs, the sheer dedication poured into each page, it's breathtaking. Imagine spending months, even years, on a single book, not just scribbling words but crafting elaborate borders, painting miniature scenes that told stories, gilding letters with real gold leaf. That's not just transcription, that's devotion made visible, and these weren't just pretty pictures either. They were teaching tools, helping those who couldn't read understand the stories of the Bible and the lives of the saints. They were declarations of faith, expressions of beauty in a world that could often be quite harsh. And let's not forget the architecture. Those magnificent monasteries, cathedrals reaching for the heavens. Monks often played a key role in their design and construction. They understood geometry, engineering, and the properties of materials. They created spaces that inspired awe and reverence, spaces that still draw millions of visitors today. That quiet majesty, that's their legacy. Moving on to literature, we find monks as the keepers of knowledge. In a world where literacy was rare, they preserved ancient texts, not just religious works, but also the writings of Greek and Roman philosophers, historians, and poets. Without their tireless efforts, many of these works would have been lost forever. And it wasn't just about copying, either. Monks were also authors in their own right. They wrote histories, chronicles, biographies, and theological treatises. They explored philosophical questions, debated doctrinal issues, and offered spiritual guidance. They gave us insights into the lives, thoughts, and beliefs of people in the Middle Ages, insights we wouldn't have otherwise. Some even penned rather colourful accounts of daily life, offering glimpses into the less than saintly behaviour we've touched on, giving us a fuller, richer picture. Now let's tiptoe into science. Yes, science. While the stereotype of the medieval monk might not immediately conjure images of groundbreaking scientific discovery, they made significant contributions. Think about it. Monasteries were centers of learning, places where observation, experimentation, and the pursuit of knowledge were valued. Monks studied astronomy, mapping the stars and planets. They developed calendars and timekeeping devices. They explored the properties of plants and herbs, creating medicinal remedies. In fact, many monastic gardens were essentially early botanical laboratories. And let's not forget about agriculture. Monks were masters of land management, developing innovative techniques for irrigation, crop rotation, and animal husbandry. They drained swamps, terraced hillsides, and transformed unproductive land into fertile fields. Their agricultural innovations not only sustained their own communities, but also helped improve food production for the wider population. Consider, for a moment, brewing. Those delightful monastic beers, it's more than just a tasty beverage. It was a science. Monks meticulously studied the fermentation process, developing techniques for brewing consistent, high-quality beer. It was safer than water, nutritious, and, well, let's be honest, probably helped them get through those long nights of chanting. Beyond art, literature, and science, the legacy of medieval monks extends to society itself. Monasteries served as centers of hospitality, providing food, shelter, and medical care to pilgrims, travelers, and the poor. They were, in many ways, the social safety net of the Middle Ages, offering assistance to those who had nowhere else to turn. They also played a role in education, establishing schools for local children and training future generations of scholars and clergy. And they often acted as mediators and peacemakers, resolving disputes between individuals and communities. They were forces of stability in a world that was often chaotic and violent. So when you think of medieval monks, don't just picture dusty old books and solemn chants. Think of vibrant art, preserved knowledge, scientific inquiry, agricultural innovation, and social compassion. Think of a legacy that continues to shape our world today. A legacy built in silence, sustained by devotion, and perhaps fueled by the occasional forbidden indulgence. Sweet dreams. Okay, so we've talked about the medieval monks, their daily lives, some of the interesting things they got up to, and how their monasteries kind of shaped the world around them. But monasticism didn't just vanish with the Reformation or the French Revolution, you know. It's still around, kicking in the 21st century. And honestly, it's kinda comforting that in this chaotic world of ours, some people are still choosing that life of prayer and contemplation. Now, modern monasticism isn't just some historical reenactment society. It's a living, breathing tradition that's adapted to the times while still holding on to those core values. You'll find contemporary orders across different Christian denominations: Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican. Even some Protestant communities are exploring monastic lifestyles. Each has its own flavor, its own rule, if you will, but they all share that fundamental commitment to seeking God through prayer, community, and service. So what do these modern monks and nuns do all day? Well, a lot of it is familiar from our medieval deep dive. Prayer is still central. They observe the Liturgy of the Hours, also known as the Divine Office, praying at specific times throughout the day, from before sunrise to late evening. It's like a constant rhythmic pulse of prayer that anchors their lives, and some would say, anchors the world. And let me tell you, knowing someone is praying for you somewhere, that's kinda nice, right? Then there's work. Monasteries still need to support themselves, and the type of work really varies. Some orders focus on traditional crafts, brewing beer, making cheese, beekeeping, weaving, all sorts of things. Others run guest houses or retreat centers, offering hospitality to visitors seeking a bit of peace and quiet. And some are involved in more modern forms of service, working in hospitals, schools, or social justice organizations. It's all about finding ways to contribute to the world while staying grounded in their monastic values. Community life is of course essential. Monks and nuns live in close proximity, sharing meals, chores, and prayer. It can be intense, to say the least. Imagine living with the same group of people day in and day out, year after year. There are bound to be disagreements and personality clashes, but the idea is to learn to live with each other, to forgive each other, and to grow in love and understanding. It's a constant process of self-reflection and striving to be a better person. Sounds exhausting, right? But there is a beauty to it too, a genuine human effort to live in peace and brotherhood. One thing that has changed is the accessibility of monastic life. In the medieval period, joining a monastery could be a one-way ticket, a complete separation from the outside world. Today, many orders allow for more interaction with the outside world. Some monks and nuns maintain contact with family and friends, use technology to communicate, and even take on temporary assignments outside the monastery. There's a recognition that monastic life doesn't have to be completely separate from the world in order to be meaningful. And speaking of technology, yeah, even monks and nuns have adapted. You'll find monasteries with websites, social media accounts, and even podcasts. They use these tools to share their wisdom, offer spiritual guidance, and connect with people around the world. It's a way of evangelizing, of spreading their message of peace and hope in a digital age. It's kind of funny to think about a medieval monk trying to understand Twitter, but hey, times change. But what's the relevance of all this? Why does monasticism matter in the 21st century? In a world that's constantly telling us to consume, to achieve, to strive for more, the monastic life offers a different path. It's a reminder that true happiness isn't found in material possessions or external success, but in inner peace and connection with something larger than ourselves. Monasteries can be places of refuge and healing, offering a space for people to disconnect from the noise and distractions of modern life and reconnect with their own souls. They can be centers of social justice, advocating for the poor and marginalized, and working to create a more just and compassionate world. And they can be beacons of hope, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of redemption and renewal. Think about it. In a world obsessed with speed and efficiency, monasteries embrace slowness and contemplation. In a world that celebrates individualism, they emphasize community and interdependence. In a world that's constantly seeking novelty and excitement, they find value in tradition and repetition. It's a countercultural witness, a living alternative to the dominant values of our society. And honestly, sometimes I think we need that. We need places where we can slow down, reflect, and reconnect with what truly matters. We need reminders that there's more to life than work, money, and status. We need examples of people who are living lives of purpose and meaning, even if it's a life that seems a bit unconventional. So next time you're feeling overwhelmed by the world, maybe take a moment to think about those modern monks and nuns. They're out there praying, working, and living a different kind of life. And who knows, maybe their example can inspire us to find a bit more peace, a bit more meaning in our own lives, even if it just means turning off our phones for an hour and enjoying the silence. Maybe. Now I'm sleepy just thinking about it all. Alright, let's drift into the final stretch of our little journey through the captivating world of medieval monks. Tonight, we're thinking about silence and why monasteries, even now, tucked away in our noisy, busy world, still pull at something deep inside us. What is it about these stone walls, these hushed corridors, that continues to fascinate? Is it simply the romantic notion of escaping the chaos of modern life? Perhaps, but I think it goes much deeper than that. Think about it. Our lives are filled with noise. The constant hum of technology, the blare of advertisements, the endless chatter of social media. It's a sensory overload. We're bombarded with information, opinions, and distractions, all vying for our attention. It's exhausting, isn't it? And that's where the monastery offers something radically different: silence. A refuge from the clamor, a space for introspection, a chance to simply be. It's not just the absence of sound, it's the presence of something else. An opportunity to connect with something bigger than ourselves, to explore the quiet corners of our own minds. Medieval monks, of course, embraced silence as a spiritual discipline. For them, it wasn't just about escaping noise, but about creating a space where they could hear the voice of God. The Benedictine rule, which guided so many monastic communities, placed a huge emphasis on taciturnitas, or silence. This wasn't a grim, joyless silence. It was a deliberate practice, a way of cultivating inner peace and attentiveness. Monks weren't forbidden from speaking altogether, but they were encouraged to be mindful of their words, to avoid idle chatter, and to use speech only when necessary, to communicate about essentials related to the daily work, or to give counsel when required. And it wasn't just silence of the mouth, it was silence of the mind too. A constant effort to quiet the internal dialogue, to focus on prayer, scripture, and contemplation. I always imagine how difficult that must have been, and honestly, probably still is. I know when I try to meditate, my mind wanders everywhere. Now you might be thinking, that sounds incredibly boring. And well, maybe it was, sometimes, but the point wasn't to be entertained, it was to be transformed, to cultivate a deeper understanding of themselves and their relationship with the divine. But even if you're not religious, the allure of silence remains. We all crave moments of peace and quiet, times when we can disconnect from the world and reconnect with ourselves. And I think that's one of the reasons why monasteries, both the ruins we visit on vacation and the active orders that still exist today, continue to captivate our imagination. They represent a different way of being, a slower pace of life, a deeper connection to the present moment. They remind us that there is value in stillness, in solitude, in simply being present in the here and now. Think about the images that come to mind when you picture a monastery: sun-dappled cloisters, monks bent over ancient texts, the gentle rustling of leaves in a quiet garden. These are images of peace, of serenity, of a world untouched by the stresses and anxieties of modern life. They speak to a longing we all share, a desire for a simpler, more meaningful existence. And while we may not all be called to become monks, we can still learn from their example. We can cultivate moments of silence in our own lives, turn off the TV, put down the phone, and simply be. Go for a walk in nature. Spend some time in quiet contemplation. Listen to music without any other distractions. Meditate, pray, read a book. It doesn't have to be a grand gesture. Even a few minutes of silence each day can make a difference. A chance to reset, to recharge, to reconnect with ourselves and with the world around us. The medieval monks may have lived in a very different time, but their wisdom is timeless. The need for silence, for introspection, for connection, these are fundamental human needs that haven't changed over the centuries. And these practices can be as simple as putting your phone down and taking a breath. So the next time you find yourself feeling overwhelmed by the noise and chaos of modern life, remember the monks, remember the allure of silence, and take a moment to find a little bit of peace within yourself. Maybe we can't all live in a monastery, but we can certainly cultivate our own personal monastery, a refuge in the busyness of modern life. And so we've reached the end of our journey into the surprisingly complex world of medieval monks. We've peeled back the layers of myth and legend, ventured beyond the stereotypes, and glimpsed the inner lives of these often misunderstood figures. We've uncovered secrets, some scandalous, some mundane, but all revealing aspects of the human experience within the cloistered walls. It's easy, isn't it, to paint these monks as relics of a bygone era, men lost in prayer and ritual, completely detached from the world. And in some ways that's true. The monastic life was about detachment, about seeking a different kind of truth, a different kind of fulfillment. But as we've seen, these weren't automatons blindly following rules. They were individuals with their own desires, their own struggles, their own temptations. They were human, just like us. And perhaps that's why their stories still resonate. We see in them reflections of ourselves, the yearning for meaning, the struggle against temptation, the search for community, the desire to leave some kind of mark on the world, however small. We've witnessed the rigorous structure of their days, the relentless cycle of prayer, work, and study. We've learned about the surprisingly varied monastic diet, from the feasts to the fasts. We've explored the scriptorium, that hallowed space where monks painstakingly preserved knowledge and created breathtaking works of art. We've tiptoed through the infirmary, where monastic medicine, though often crude by modern standards, offered care and comfort to the sick. But we've also delved into the darker corners of monastic life. We've seen evidence of power struggles, personal disputes, and the all-too-human tendency to break the rules. We've encountered instances of drunkenness, gluttony, and other sins within the cloister. We've explored the constant tension between celibacy and the temptations of the flesh. We've even touched upon accusations of corruption, abuse of power, and unexplained deaths. It's important to remember that these were not isolated incidents. While monasticism undoubtedly produced saints and scholars, it also attracted individuals seeking power, escaping responsibility, or simply seeking a structured life within a world of chaos. The cloister, like any institution, was susceptible to human failings. But even with these revelations of human fallibility, the enduring impact of medieval monks on Western civilization is undeniable. Think about it. They were the custodians of knowledge during the Dark Ages, preserving classical texts and transmitting them to future generations. Without the scriptoria, countless works of literature, philosophy, and science would have been lost forever. The very foundation of Western learning owes a great debt to these dedicated scribes. Monks also made significant contributions to art and architecture. They built magnificent cathedrals and monasteries, creating spaces of breathtaking beauty that inspired awe and devotion. They developed new artistic techniques, from manuscript illumination to stained glass, enriching the cultural landscape of medieval Europe. And let's not forget their contributions to agriculture and horticulture. Monks were skilled farmers and gardeners, experimenting with new techniques and cultivating a wide variety of crops. They improved agricultural practices, contributing to food production and self-sufficiency within their communities and beyond. Moreover, monasteries played a crucial role in providing hospitality to pilgrims and travelers. They offered shelter, food, and medical care to those in need, embodying the Christian ideals of charity and compassion. In a world often characterized by violence and instability, monasteries served as centers of peace and stability. They offered a refuge from the turmoil of the secular world, a place where learning, contemplation, and spiritual growth could flourish. Even their economic activities, often criticized for contributing to monastic wealth, had positive effects. Monasteries invested in infrastructure, supported local communities, and provided employment. They were often major economic engines in their regions. So, as we close this chapter, let's not reduce the medieval monks to simple caricatures, either as pious saints or corrupt sinners. They were complex, multifaceted figures whose lives reflect the full spectrum of human experience. They were products of their time, shaped by the social, political, and religious forces that surrounded them. And while their way of life may seem distant and irrelevant to our modern world, their legacy continues to resonate. They remind us of the importance of preserving knowledge, fostering community, seeking meaning beyond the material, and striving to live a life of purpose, even amidst imperfection. The secrets we've uncovered, the shocking revelations we've explored, ultimately serve to humanize these figures. They remind us that even within the rigid structure of the monastic life, there was room for individuality, for creativity, for both virtue and vice. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of all. To see the monks not as distant figures from the past, but as fellow humans, grappling with the same fundamental questions that we face today. What is the meaning of life? How do we find happiness? How do we live a life of purpose? And how do we reconcile our ideals with our all too human imperfections? These are questions that resonate across the centuries, connecting us to the monks of the Middle Ages in a profound and meaningful way. So the next time you think of medieval monks, I hope you'll remember the complexities of their lives, the secrets they kept, and the enduring impact they had on shaping our world. And perhaps, just perhaps, you'll find a little bit of yourself reflected in their stories. Good night.